Good to see you. All right. A lot of questions, a lot to talk about, but I want to start out by talking about what many have called the greatest rivalry in sports, and that is Petersburg versus Frankfurt High School. Okay, if you just tell me more about that.
You're going back many years.
I asked our mutual friend Oliver Luck for a little inside information, and so he fed me Frankfurt as your rival and said it puts Ohio State and Michigan to shame. So
That's funny. My fellow Vikings back at Petersburg High School will be thrilled
yeah.
to hear this.
Got I know I have a big audience base in Petersburg, so I really wanted to make sure I shouted them out. But I do want to actually start with your athletic career when you were an athlete. As I understand it, in youth baseball, there was no girls team, so you played on the boys team.
Yes, that's correct. Grant
Okay.
County.
Can you tell me how it feels to go from there to being now the second female athletic director at Rutgers?
Yeah, it feels fantastic. But yeah, so I grew up in a really small town in Petersburg, West Virginia, about 2,100 of us. And so not a ton of sports offerings, particularly at that time back in the 80s. As a result, there was no softball program. If you were going to play baseball, you played with the boys. My father was a big baseball fan and loved third base and taught a young daughter how to field and catch and hit pretty well. Unfortunately, I was really slow. And so I had to really hit to the fence in order to make it to second or third base. And that doesn't usually lend itself to a budding career beyond the diamond in a youth field in Petersburg, West Virginia. But a number of other sports, again, in the youth setting, which certainly developed a strong love of sport really early in my life.
And tell me then, in being in your position, and we'll get into and what you're doing at Rutgers and all the changes that are going on, but can you talk about how you view the role of women's sports in at the collegiate level? And there's a lot of uncertainty. I think there's always been uncertainty, but there's been a lot of uncertainty expressed about the future of Olympic sports and potentially women's sports. So can you talk about how that fits into what you're doing as you're trying to compete at football, men's and women's basketball, and everything else?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see us prioritize our women's programs here at Rutgers and lean into really all of our Olympic sports beyond football and basketball. Part of that comes from certainly a passion and energy in the space, but also a background. Sometimes you're largely a result of some of the things you've seen and experienced in your past. And I've been able to be a part of a few athletic departments that had really successful Olympic sports, and particularly on the women's side of things, saw the real value in that, right? There's a significant brand value and momentum that's taken place in recent years relative to women's sports. And so you'll see us lean into that here, and thrilled with the opportunity to do.
Great. All right. So let's talk about what the topic that's on everyone's mind in college sports, and that is the future, the present of college sports, where things are going. And you've been pretty open about the need to generate more revenue for your athletic department. I saw in one of the interviews you said that, at least for Rutgers, that it's more of a revenue problem than a cost problem at this point. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so if you look at where we were in the bulk of our revenue categories, whether that was the partnership and multimedia rights space or tickets, donor contributions, you name it, we were on the low end of a number of those categories when you stack that up next to your peers. And you can't be there if you're going to find yourself in both a more competitive place in the landscape, but also being more fiscally sound and sustainable for what a lot of athletic directors and universities across the country are seeking. And so we had some work to do in that space. Thrilled with the progress we've been able to make here in the first 10 months, and our early projections for next fiscal year and the year thereafter are really promising. So we have to now go out and continue to work the plan that we've drafted and to capitalize on that space. We have spent more time on the expense side of it. There are also some areas there that you will see us pull back on, but for the most part, our focal point is the revenue and will continue to be as such.
Okay. And let's talk about some of the ways that you are going about generating more revenue. I think, as you said, some of it is just looking at where your opportunities are to grow, but you've taken a pretty significant step in restructuring or reforming the athletic department and its revenue generating. So, can you talk a little bit about what you've done and why you've done it?
Yeah, the biggest step forward was hiring a chief revenue officer and one who was super successful and performing at a really high level. And so I plucked away one of the top folks at Ohio State University and Todd Nicely. And he actually serves not just as our chief revenue officer, but also as my top deputy and our COO. And certainly having someone of his skill set and capability in that space was a huge step forward. He and I together were able to form Scarlet Knight Enterprises, which has been a big focal point here over the past 6, 7 months, which gives us an opportunity to monetize the athletics department and specifically to some of those revenue generation categories in a way that we haven't been able to do in the past. And so we're excited to get that off of the ground and have a board that is assembled both of external parties, but also 3 appointments internally so that you've got currently 7 people who can come together as advisory and oversight of an area that's obviously extremely important to our future.
And so traditional model had been the athletic director and the deputy is the associate. You have your external people, you have your SID, and then a lot of schools had used MMR partners to license their whatever their media rights were, their IP, ticket sales. And we're now in this new era where, as you mentioned, revenue generation is even more important. So tell us how SKE is different than the traditional model and why you think it's better in terms of revenue generation than the traditional model.
Yeah, so the biggest difference is obviously not having to share or outsource your financials with someone else, right? When you're controlling your destiny in that space and you seek a naming rights partner, and if that naming rights partner is going to give you 2 million, 3 million, 4 million a year, whatever it is to put their name on that inventory, that's all coming into the athletics department versus a situation where in a traditional MMR, it may be a revenue share, it may be a percentage split, and instead you get to control that asset. And so certainly from a financial standpoint, there's some significant upside there. You also though have to be capable and able effectively performing in that space. And so therein lies the necessity to hire people with the skill set to be able to go do it and assemble yourself around folks who are going to help identify a vision and a strategy and things to move forward. But it is a great opportunity that if you can get the right team of people and those who are willing to hustle and to do so at a high level, you can find yourself in a place where you can have quite a significant increase in that growth. We're projecting here at the current close of the year up 117% from last fiscal year in the corporate partnership space alone, and early projections for the next year are showing another 33% on top of that. So if we're up 150% just in that one category, that's
Right.
not talking about tickets, that's not talking about monetizing our facilities and some of these other things. That's some pretty significant growth. And so we're thrilled again with how it's currently performing. Now the plan and expectation is to propel it even to a higher level.
And so it's interesting. So it's both that you're generating more revenue, but also keeping it, as opposed to sharing it with whoever the MMR partner might be and leaving things to their control. And there have been questions. I don't think saying anything controversial about whether MMR partners at certain schools were doing enough and whether that model was sustainable. There are plenty of MMR partners who are doing quite well. So I think maybe everybody's finding what works best for them. But in terms of competing in the Big Ten, and you've talked about uh, some of the challenges, and some of that comes from just not having the same revenue to spend on your teams as maybe some of your competitors in the Big Ten. A lot of the conversation over the last couple of months has been about ways that schools are trying to provide compensation to their athletes above and beyond the revenue sharing cap, that 20.5 million ish from this year that will go up next year, and trying to find NIL deals for the athletes and NIL deals that will be cleared by the College Sports Commission. And as Nebraska has just arbitrated a case where a number of their football player deals were rejected by the CSC that were facilitated and done by their MMR partner. And as I understand it, they resubmitted those deals, but clearly a lot of schools are using MMR partners to try to increase the NIL opportunities for their athletes. How does that work at Rutgers where you don't have, where the MMR partner is now you, that's been internalized?
Yeah, so the way that works is all NIL, whether you're working, whether you have your marketing agency and capability through house, similar to what a Scarlet Knight Enterprises is, or a traditional MMR via Learfield or a Playfly, all name, image, and likeness opportunities as a result of the House settlement, and this all became effective July 1 of 2025, have to come from a valid business purpose. And in addition to that valid business purpose, there has to be a true marketing opportunity between that student athlete and that brand. And the construct of the contract is essentially one that's assembled to what they refer to as deliverables, right? Those deliverables are the marketing activity that takes place with that athlete and that brand, whether that's social media content or appearances or activations or commercials, right? You name it. There's a whole host of things that people can use in that marketing space. And so in the case of a Scarlet Knight Enterprises, we are essentially serving as the party to help facilitate that opportunity between the athlete and that brand. And then that contract reflects that accordingly. Not necessarily completely unique from what schools who utilize a Learfield or a Playfly are doing, but there appears to be a level of scrutiny on those MMR partners due to some things that grew out of concern for warehousing and
Right.
taking your MMR contract and guaranteeing certain dollars in that NIL marketing space without it coming from a direct brand, right? If it's coming
Right.
from Learfield or a Playfly, that's different from it coming directly from a corporate partner and brand. And so you're seeking to accomplish the latter, certainly within the role that we have and the structure of a Scarlet Knight Enterprises, you really eliminate any opportunity to warehouse or to utilize that third party money from an MMR partner because that party doesn't exist.
And so that sort of leads to my question. If the warehousing is ultimately permitted or some variation of it, and so that the Learfields and the Playflies and the JMIs are giving significant amounts of money to buy up these athlete licensing rights and they make the modification so that it gets approved by the CSC, which has not happened yet, it would seem like that might be more challenging for an internal group to be able to warehouse NIL rights. So I'm just wondering if that ultimately potentially becomes a disadvantage if MMR partners are treated more third parties and less like boosters, which I know is what's being litigated and arbitrated right now. But I just wonder if that becomes a potential concern.
It's not a concern. And I actually don't believe that does become an issue. And the reason I say that is at the end of the day, the thing that matters most in this space is that you have the highest funding. Right? In other
Right.
words, whoever has the most partnerships and the most lucrative opportunities, which then increases your third party NIL, that's the number one priority. And so there again, when you're not having to share any of those dollars with an outside party, you should be, to a certain respect, a step ahead. Now, oftentimes those relationships with the MMR holders and some of the real value there surrounds national brands, right? National brands tend to work with those parties in a way where the schools that are then among that membership have an opportunity for that piece. For a Rutgers University, where our brand value may not yet be at that national level. We haven't found ourselves in a place where that's problematic for us. And admittedly, our path forward, at least in the short term, and where we've been really successful, is living more in those local and regional markets. Ton of people, ton of corporate opportunities and companies and businesses that have leaned into this to support third party and to do so in a way where we're able to market accordingly to what I just shared. So I don't believe it's a concern for a Rutgers. Rather, I believe if that were to present itself the same way that a Learfield or a Playfly could enter into an agreement for those rights with the athletes, Scarlet Knight Enterprises could do the same. And in fact, we may be more nimble and efficient in being able to do so because we don't have all of those layers of a third party to have to work through some of those constraints.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And as you said, the goal is to ensure that these are legitimate NIL deals, and you as an institution are better equipped to do that and also be able to capture all of the revenue as opposed to sharing it. And then ultimately, as again, as you said, that leads to more money to the athletes, which is what everybody's trying to do within the rules. Is part of the conversation over the last, I don't know how many years, but certainly has amplified recently, the fear that the spending has is getting out of control if it's not already out of control. And so you talked about the revenue side of that, that you can generate more revenue so that you can afford to spend more. What is your sense about the stability of the current model and whether we are on the verge of another significant shift or whether this is going to be the status quo for a while? There's obviously a lot of talk about what Congress may or may not do, but you have to worry about what you're doing today and tomorrow and next week and not what Congress might do in 6 months or a year. So talk about it from the athletic director's position of whether and how you operate in a world where there seems to be uncertainty, but you have to do your job and you have to
Yeah.
make Rutgers competitive.
Yeah, and the mentality that we have here that will continue to guide us and hopefully continue to serve us well is one where you control what you can control, right? And we do believe, and I believe, learned a number of years ago, thankfully, there's opportunity in chaos, and there's no doubt that's a chaotic landscape and one that is definitely facing some serious financial pressure. I don't think you would find an athletics director anywhere in the country right now who feels comfortable with what we've been seeing, particularly here in the past 12 months. And I say that because there was an expectation from many that when we were able to start sharing revenue with our student athletes, that while there would likely be some level of third-party NIL above and beyond that 22% of those revenue streams, no one anticipated that the market would continue to support what it did, largely through the football transfer portal and most recently the men's basketball portal. And so
Right.
the concern now is, okay, if we just saw this over the past two transfer cycles, what does it look like then in the 26-27 year? Is that same growth expected? And if it is, it's growing at a pace that no one has ever seen those
Right.
type of numbers, and no one expected that to happen. And I believe what you will see, if there's not a sizable shift in it, because there's going to need to be some external parties that support that, you will begin to see a lot of planning and thought process around what does the future of college athletics look like. And I think you'll begin to see a different path charted, but how quickly those things come together are obviously governed by a whole lot of systems and legislative processes and all these other
Right.
things that you only have so much control over from a timing standpoint. But in short form, the financials are a real issue, and everybody is seeking to find a more stable path for the future.
And what do you think, from your perspective, has caused the lack of stability? You mentioned that the thought and the hope was that post House settlement with this new structure, it would provide this direct revenue sharing, and then there'd be NIL opportunities, but there would be more regulation of it, more control over it. And instead, in some ways, we're seeing the same NIL spending, plus or minus, and the 22% revenue sharing. So, what do you think has not worked the way you expected it to?
Yeah, I'd say you had a lot of issues even before last summer, and that new era ushered in. And that was a direct result of essentially the patchwork of state law that cropped up all across the country in response to a governance structure where people recognized, oh, wait a minute. This is the current circumstance is not working for my school, or I don't feel like I have a big enough advantage over this competitor or that competitor. So
Right.
let me work within my state and the ability to chart a different path forward completely outside of the governance structure that has existed forever. And
Right.
as people made their own rules, and various member institutions in various conferences charted a completely different path, then the chaos and instability started to crop up in a way where now people are not really being part of the same governance structure and rules and protocols and parameters that are intended to create stability. They also obviously created a lot of opinions and concerns, and in some cases, constraint that was determined to be a real problem. But I think a lot of people would share who's been a part of this. And now, myself having been in the world of college sports for 24 years, the pendulum swung from one end to the other. And I think
Right.
anytime you find yourself in that level of extreme, it is ripe with concerns and issues. And instead, it would have been great to likely find ourselves in a more median path on a lot of these issues. And instead, the floodgates opened up, and now it's very difficult to get that under control. So I think it started well before this past summer, unfortunately. And now, figuring out how to address those issues, there needs to be a much higher body than ourselves beyond the NCAA and what appears to be beyond the CSC.
Right. And so one outcome could be that Congress does pass something, and there's discussion about the Senate making some progress on a bipartisan bill, and that would could potentially address most of these issues. We'll see what's in that legislation and if it passes. And I think everybody understood that one of the limitations of the House settlement is that it was an antitrust settlement. It was not designed, nor did it have the authority to create a new governance structure for all of college sports. And so if Congress doesn't do it, and it doesn't look like necessarily the current model will work, what other paths do you see? Because in Congress, maybe they will come in and save the day, but maybe they won't. And if they don't, what do you see as the path forward? And there's obviously been a lot of talk about potential breakaway of particular conferences and super leagues and all sorts of different proposals out there. What do you see as the path, and what do you think is best for Rutgers and best for college athletics as a whole?
Yeah, so I think the initial path would be one that you just talked about. There's going to be, in that situation, an increasing pressure on commissioners and more specifically to the Power Four conferences to figure out how to govern, administer, and oversee their member institutions. Is that collectively as a group? Is that to splinter off into something separate, right? It's too early to tell as to
Yeah.
how that may proceed. I do think what's best for college sports is that we work together in order to create a system that's never going to work for every individual
Right.
institution. At the core of this thing is competition, right? We're competing against one another all day, every day, and there's going to be a winner and loser that shows up in each of those competitive arenas. And so we've got to understand that, but recognize and figure out a good of the group, a majority, and an area of stability that still allows us to continue in a space in the future where college sports as a whole continues to be widely celebrated, widely successful, and all those other things. I think for Rutgers and where we're at, is we're going to continue to do what we've been doing over the past 10 months. And that's to take the current circumstances, whether they're stable or unstable, and certainly they're the latter right now, and
Right.
figure out how do we find ourselves in a place to be successful in the midst of some of these issues and challenges. And that's where we'll continue to have that focal point. Certainly, it's my job as the athletics director and as a member institution within the Big Ten to be a part of the broader discussion and things at a higher level. And I'm going to continue to do that as well. But certainly, my main focal point is what's best for Rutgers.
And last two quick questions, just picking up on that. How do you, and I'm sure you've talked about this many times with your boosters and your coaches and your alum, but how do you define success for Rutgers? And let's stick with football and men's and women's basketball. Not to say that the other sports don't matter, but that obviously is where much of the focus is and why there's this need for revenue generation. How do you define success, and what do you think is a realistic path? Because the great thing about Indiana football, for example, is that it gives hope to schools that have not been traditional football powerhouses that they can be the next national champion. We are dealing with this at Tulane. It's a positive thing that we made it to the college football playoff, and now there's the expectation that every year we'll make it to the college football playoff. And as you just said, unfortunately, not everybody can make it to the playoffs. If you could, sports wouldn't be very fun, and so there have to be winners and losers. So it can't be a realistic expectation for any school to win the championship every year. But what is the sort of your expectation and what you've told the fans and the alum and everybody else what they can expect? Or, it doesn't always go according to plans, but what is your goal?
Yeah, so, and a big thing, and we haven't talked a lot about it, but it should be noted, is obviously Rutgers University offers a world-class education which positions young men and young women for an incredible opportunity in their life after college. The academic component of this and supporting that academic mission and focal point is critical and paramount. We will continue to do that. Rutgers has done well in that space. We've got high performing athletes in the academic side of things, and the university as a whole is really strong in that space.
Right.
Looking specifically at the athletics component of this, there's really three things that will measure our success. And fortunately, numbers will allow us to determine really quickly whether or
Right.
not whether we're getting that wrong or whether we're staying flat. And certainly we don't want the latter two to happen. And that involves increasing our revenue, which we've talked about, reducing expenses that are not helping us win and compete at a higher level. And number three, which will be most telling, is a more competitive program, right? Winning at a higher level, winning games that matter, that bring great attention and excitement and passion and energy to everybody who's a part of this thing. And if we can find ourselves in a place as early as the next fiscal year and academic year where we see more revenue, less expenses, and more winning, that's going to be a good
Right.
spot for us to be in at the close of that year.
And when people hear that second bucket, the reducing expenses, I think some people immediately go to, does that mean there's going to be elimination of sports, or there's going to be a tiering of sports? And I know you've talked about this in other contexts, but if you could just explain how you view the role of broad-based athletic opportunities, and because that is an option for lots of schools. It's not a popular option, but there are a lot of expenses that come with other sports. So that is a way to reduce expenses. But tell me what your view is on that approach.
Yeah, and we have not modeled out what it looks like for us to cut programs because that's just not where we are. We believe that we have a path forward by continuing to support all 24. We might not be able to fund all 24 at the highest level in the league or at a competitive place to feel
Right.
great that each one of those programs can be really successful athletically, but nonetheless, we're committed to the opportunities for those 24 programs. And so when you look at reducing your expenses, you're looking at things of areas of excess that just don't matter as much anymore or matter as much as the current landscape of supporting investments directly in the roster, right? And so if you find yourself in a place where you're spending to put a 106 seater plane in the air, but you only needed a 30 or 50 seater, right? You're probably going to scale back and travel a 30 to 50 seater. If you are traveling in a way where you don't need to stay at a certain place or travel that large of a travel party, if you're purchasing meals and there's 70 people on a roster and an entire travel party, and 70 meals is enough to sufficiently fuel them and meet your competitive expectations, you don't need to purchase 90 meals and throw 20 in the trash. And so it's living in a budget with some fiscal responsibility that, oh, by the way, that budget was mapped out as compared to what the peer institutions that we're competing against were spending. And so you can look at the numbers and very quickly say, all right, what's the median of the Big Ten spend in every single one of these programs? In areas
Right.
where you're above that, whether that's in travel or nutrition or personnel or you name it, there's all kinds of categories, equipment, right? All these things. And you're here when your performance is here or lower, right? How do we then bridge that gap? And so those are the type of things that we've been doing. And certainly on a budget of our size, you've been able to come up with a number of areas there that show a lot of opportunity for improvement and been able to implement those, fortunately, with coaches and staff who all collectively as a group have looked at it and said, yeah, that's not going to harm us in recruiting, and that's not going to
Right.
harm us in retention, and that's not going to harm us competitively. We can do without that spend. And so those are the type of things that we've been working through over the past number of months.
Yeah. And then thank you. That's very helpful. And then last question. You've lived in Morgantown, you lived in Baton Rouge, you're now living in New Jersey. I don't know if you're in New Brunswick or Piscataway or somewhere in that general area. Tell me one thing that is surprisingly similar about those three locations and one thing that is maybe quite different about those three locations.
Yeah, so quite different, certainly from LSU to Rutgers. Climate, right? Significantly. A little more comparable to West Virginia and my days at the University of Maryland. But
Yeah.
the climate from the bayou to the Northeast is very different. And similarities, we may not have the same number of passionate fans that exist in some of my prior stops, one that we won't stop until we certainly see those numbers increase, but still a very supportive and passion filled and competitive fan base who wants to win, right? When I came in, one of the questions that I asked our president when we were having a conversation about this opportunity is, do they want to win there? I knew he wanted to, and that's extremely important to an athletics director to have a president and a university administration who want to win. But you also need it to show up in the community, in the state, and in the fan base. And I was thrilled to hear that they do. Now, since I've been able to be here over the past 10 months, I've been able to see it, feel it, spend a lot of time with those people. And so now it's working together, creating some strategy, and working really hard to get it in a much better place. And that's what we're seeking to do.
And how's the food in New Jersey compared to down here?
Amazing. Admittedly, we love an Italian over a seafood option. So
Ah,
it has been fantastic for myself and even more so my husband, who was
yeah.
thrilled with that piece of it.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the time and all the insight and the thoughts. And I wish you the best of luck, not just Oliver Luck, but the best of luck overall. And it's going to be exciting to watch because it's awesome to see people who have dedicated their careers to college sports get to the highest level and to be able to sit in the chair and to see all the changes you're making. And then, as you said, there's some pretty easy metrics. There's some pretty easy indications of success. And so I look forward to seeing Rutgers rise. I'm a Northeast guy originally, so I am supportive of all New York, New Jersey college athletics.
Awesome. Fantastic. Gabe, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I appreciate you spending some time here today. So
Yeah.
thank
And look forward to having you back on once you're celebrating some national championships.
you. Amen.
All right. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for listening. And thanks as always to my loyal sponsor, the Tulane Center for Sport. See you next time on Sportswise.